Welcome to the Flight Club Podcast, a woman's guide to leaning out. We give you a behind-the-scenes look at business launch and growth through the stories of successful female entrepreneurs. Here's your host, Felina Hansen, founder and CEO of Hera Hub.
Hello and welcome. I am excited for my conversation today with Jessica Porté. She is a mom, a wife, and the founder and CEO of Wayfinder Family, a coaching and consulting agency that supports families and organizations and helps them navigate grief, loss, and change. She has over 12 years of experience in nonprofits, working with family systems facing challenges related to grief, addiction, and other forms of loss that impact families and communities. Jessica has experience in management, group facilitation, crisis intervention, professional training, bereavement camp leadership and development, and developing community and school programming. Welcome to the show today, Jessica.
Thank you, Felina, for having me.
Absolutely. So let's dive in. You had an interesting sort of start in psychology. So you went to school for psychology. Why did you choose that path?
So my path into getting my major in psychology actually came from not going to school. So when I graduated from high school, I went straight into community college. And then, as sometimes happens in young adolescents, I veered off into different paths, trying to figure out a different way into the career world. And when I decided to return, it happened in 2008 because of the recession. I was laid off. Mm-hmm. And the reason I was laid off is because I was the only person without my degree. Mm-hmm. So that was my signal to go back. Okay, this is not going to be the thing that stands in my way. And when I came back, I actually realized through my counselor, my second counselor when I returned, is that I was only one credit away from transferring to a state college. Mm. And I remember thinking, oh my gosh, like I didn't even know that I was that close to moving, if only I had known. And so I went back initially with a psychology degree to be a college counselor. I was like, I'm going to do this better. That was my attitude. I'm like, I'm going to go into this and I am going to make sure kids know how close they are to each benchmark. So they don't make the mistakes that I did. But that was my initial move into psychology. And then that was until I had a woman come into my class and talk about potential programs under bereavement care. And so that's when it started to shift a little bit.
Okay, interesting. So, and what in between your community college experience, and I also went to community college, one of the best choices I made, frankly. I'm a huge advocate for community college. What were the types of things and work you were doing between going back to school?
I agree. I agree so much. It gave me the opportunity to really kind of find myself in that process and refine. So that time between community college and when I went back, I was actually working in the hospitality industry. I was a marketing ambassador for a organization that had like wine and spirits and some auto industry bigwigs. And so I would actually create their field marketing teams, their events planning and event coordination, and go out and help implement those market research as well as marketing presence and depending on the event. So if we were marketing the Daimler Chrysler truck, we were at all of the local, I don't know, like anything from, basketball events to where that demographic would focus. But that was my main base that I was in before.
Okay, awesome. I would imagine some of that experience perhaps helps you in your business now, since marketing is such a big part of what we have to do as business owners.
Absolutely. I am grateful for how it has shown up in my life. It took a back burner for the last decade, but it has definitely been really helpful as my tool.
Yeah, absolutely. Awesome. Okay, so you're armed with a degree in psychology. What did you do next?
So afterwards, going back to that moment when I was in my course in the psychology club, there was a woman who came in and started talking about bereavement camp for children who are impacted by a loss. And I never knew anything like that existed. So when I found out, I took the opportunity to go to that camp and take the training. And my whole idea that I was going to be a college counselor shifted. And I realized this is the work I want to do. I want to help be an advocate in the space for children and families. And so I actually started interning with that program. When I graduated, I ended up being their group coordinator and facilitator. I started working in the schools. And then I really developed a passion for leaning into these hard conversations with families and helping them make space for this spot to talk honestly with their children in a way that not only fosters communication and connection, but also gives them an opportunity to process some of the hard things. And what do we do when we make space for that? And what do we do to help elevate how we care for one another and cope? So I worked in the space for about over a decade. And in near the end of that time, I was having this big toss up of, do I go clinical and do I get licensed? Because those were most of the people I worked with. And while I felt like that was a lot of the path that was put forth, it just didn't feel right for myself. I didn't feel like that's where I was meant to do my work. And I started looking up leadership development. Like, what does it mean to have these conversations within our organizations? How do we recognize leadership in the family, within a child, and the cultural and social changes that we can make in leadership? So I actually went back for my master's in leadership at Azusa Pacific University, and it really helped me develop what does it mean to have a voice on a platform where we can make changes not only with families in these spaces, but in the boardrooms, in schools, in organizations, and in how we talk to each other.
It's so interesting. Was there something earlier in your life, Jessica, that because this is interesting work, not, this isn't something we talk about a lot. Was there something that was within earlier life that you feel helped lead you to this?
Oh boy, such a big question. There was two. I'll narrow it down to two key pivotal moments that I realized that the value in this work. And one was when I first started back into that moment when I was training for that bereavement camp and training to be an intern. So in this space, you really create a opportunity for children to share their story, validate, help them understand what grief is, right? We often use the word grief to explain how we're feeling after death. But when you reflect, but what is grief? It's a pretty big definition, right? It's the change in our identity. It's the change in who we are. It's a change in our relationships. And it's not just the feelings. It's definitely the feelings, but there's so much more that changes in our life. And sometimes we are not the same person after it. And I remember when one of the things they did for us to really understand the gravity of what it meant in childhood bereavement and to facilitate a child group, we had to bring in a picture of someone we lost, and we had to facilitate from a child's lens, and they ran group. And I remember when they came to me and asked about my grandfather, who was a very big patriarchal piece of my family, I wept. And I was like, oh my gosh, where did this come from? I've never processed like this. Why is this happening to me? And then I got it. I was like, oh, that's why we don't create enough space to talk about it. We have a tendency in our culture to either, when we hear pain, want to fix it right away, or we try to change the subject and we bring levity. But how much time do we give to really process this so that there is actual opportunity to understand what that feels like? And so when I realized as a 20-something-year-old that I was having this response. And then I saw the power of when kids had the opportunity to validate and understand their sense of self and what they were going through at such a younger age. I was like, wow, that's so cool. And now they're saying what they need. And now they're able to communicate with their parents. And now they can advocate in schools that this is a hard day because it's my dad's anniversary. I would have never been able to do that. So that was one key moment. And that's when I became a child advocate. And then it was right before I returned to my leadership program. And this was also in the midst of the pandemic. I realized I had my own twins and they were 4 years old. And all of a sudden, I understood not only as a child advocate, but what does it mean to be a family advocate? What do we do in this space to help parents? Because we're helping children. I always had this unique way, unique programs where we were able to work in children facilitated groups. But, as parents, we have to be learning this language too. There was such a difference when kids were able to return home to a family where they were practicing the same skills, where they were able to understand, because, we also come from a generation where we didn't talk about it. So I became to focus and shift my focus into, wow, like I'm a child advocate, but in order to be a true child advocate, I have to be a family advocate. So that's when I really wanted to start gathering the community. Let's lean into these hard conversations. Let's talk, because they're not going anywhere. And I think the recent years have shown that. And so that was my almost second launch in the shift of what I was doing with my life.
Oh, interesting. And wow. And the work that you did around addiction, will you talk about that and supporting families?
Yeah. That was another moment where the plans that I had shifted. And so the program where I did the bereavement camp and did the group trainings with was shuttered due to just funding and the struggles of nonprofit. And one of the places that we worked really close with was the Hazelton Betty Ford Foundation and their children's program. So they have a children's program that support children who've been impacted by a loved one's addiction. And that program is for children ages 7 to 12 years old. And when I was able to get into be a children's counselor in their program, I learned a whole new understanding of what that meant to support children through a living loss. When you are missing and grieving someone that isn't psychologically or physically there, but they're not dead. And so what that taught me, one, is just the opportunity to talk to children and what that looks like in something that complex, but also the road to recovery, both for someone who's in addiction and the family around them. And so I learned a lot about grace and education, but also, in those programs, what we really focused on is helping children understand that this disease is not their fault. Their opportunity and job is to be a child and to be a kid and have fun. And that, this is not something, that addiction is independent of the one person that they love. And we help unravel that for them. So I learned a lot in that program, and I have really fortunate to work with a lot of patients, families, and professionals who taught me a lot, especially Jerry Moe, who actually created that program with Mrs. Ford.
Wow. Such important work. Let's get to your business, Wayfinder Family. You have something that you noted here that I actually want to read because it's just so beautifully written, Jessica. And I think it's just so impactful. When I read this, it really hit me. You write, people are constantly exploring ways to cultivate a balance between productivity and joy. Often the plan we map out to achieve those goals rarely happens as expected. Life throws us for loops, and those loops can be laced with grief, uncertainty, and a change of identity. They shift our world and adjust our plans. I believe leadership is defined in each of us as we empower our voice, define our values, lead our families, and be part of a community. Talk about that statement, please.
Absolutely. You know, I think a key moment for me in the work that I did is understanding that we have such a finite way of what we understand with grief. We attach grief to death because it's a clear line of when we know it happens. But we rarely acknowledge it in the things that we go through and the living losses that occur in even the good change that happens. I go back to the moment when I married my husband. There was this great change and we were loving and embracing it. But around that change, we had moved homes. We had both changed careers. My grandfather died. We battled infertility. We grieved miscarriages. And when you look at a moment like that, you can piece out maybe my grandfather and my miscarriages, but there was grief in all of that. I was grieving my community. I was grieving who I thought I was as a single woman living by the beach. And then all of a sudden I was a married woman in the desert with now working in bereavement. And it wasn't until I recognized, wow, I'm not only going through a transformation, I think there's something else here. And it was the grief that was attached to that. And I think when we acknowledge that process, when we're going through change and we're creating our plan, there is a whole experience that is being missed when we do not bring in that framework of taking care of ourselves and bring in that framework of validating our needs in that experience. Because there's this balance. We're like, well, this is a happy change, so I'm going to cling to that happy change. But when we fold in all of these needs and the joy of those changes, but also what we might be missing from our previous identity or who we were, there's validation in both of that, and those can coexist. A lot of times we think that if there is a loss, that only sadness is attached, and it's so much more complex. And when we demystify all of that, we have an opportunity to advocate and not only lead for ourselves, but lead for others in a way that gives them permission to have that exploration process. And then that keeps reverberating in a way where, okay, now that we understand where we're at, what does that mean? Sometimes that means I need to sit more with it. And sometimes I'm ready to help this, redefine my purpose or redefine my values, or strengthen who I am as a person, or question things that weren't serving me. And so I think when we give space to that cultivation, we really instill this sense of leadership, which I believe starts right in ourselves and our homes. And then it's how we authentically do it in our community and then in our work.
Absolutely. So how do you work, Jessica? How do you work with families? Like, what does this process look like if I wanted to hire you? How do I do that?
Yeah, so I work a lot with organizations, both nonprofit and for-profit, in helping them develop. If they work with families at all, and they want to develop a grief-informed lens or understand the family systems, or have even substance use disorders, or even just what does it mean to cultivate a space where and programming around support groups for families and children, I am available that way. I've helped do program development. I helped get up and running support groups, as well as done community outreach and how to help elevate that approach. And then what I like to do also is work with families directly. So this is where I use grief education through support, grief support through grief education, where we actually have an opportunity to talk as a family of what that looks like. So much of my work before was doing grief education with professionals, but my goal in my programs is to help the families understand what that looks like, not only so they can show up for their child, but for themselves better, and to reintegrate things that are super important in grief. And one of the most important things for children in grief is play. And as adults, we forget how to do that, and we start to take so many things seriously. And so my programs are really focused on helping families create a great foundation and then create their own path with the program.
Amazing. And what is one or two things that you're looking forward to in your business? You launched just about a year ago, which is congratulations on that year mark. What are some of the things that you're working on? Yeah.
So some of the things I'm working on is I'm actually in the midst of working on some research I'm hoping to get published soon on just the importance of grief-informed care mixed with the importance of leadership and what we know from organizational and system changes and what does that look like, because while we acknowledge grief as an individual, we all are living within some type of system. And so there is a connection there. And so I've been building a framework off of that I'm really excited about. And secondly, I am consulting with some really great organizations in the next few months, both locally and nationally. So I'm looking forward to what those look like. And one's actually working with schools and bereavement, and the other is working with a treatment and recovery center looking to develop a program.
Fantastic. Wow. You are doing such important work, Jessica, and something that we just, as we said before, we don't talk about this. I mean, it just, I know so many people lost friends and family throughout COVID. And it's something that we just, as my friend says, stuff in a sock a lot of times and just do not really tackle these important pieces of our life. So I really appreciate the work you're doing, especially in supporting children.
Thank you. I appreciate it so much, Lena.
Absolutely. If folks do want to learn more about you, about the business, what's the best way to get in touch with you?
The best way to get in touch is through my website. It's wayfinder.family. So instead of a .com, it's family. So it's wayfinder.family. And through there, you can get connected through my social. I have bookings and everything that you need, and even local and virtual events that are coming up.
Fantastic. Awesome. Thanks for sharing some time with me today, Jessica.
I appreciate it, Paulina. Thank you for having me.
Thank you for joining this week's episode of Flight Club, sponsored by Hera Hub. We look forward to sharing more success stories with you soon.